Okay, take two. And it's been a little while since I recorded an episode. Last week, I was actually at a doctor's appointment. So that's why I didn't do an episode last week, and I just didn't find the time between now and then. So it's actually been a while. But this is Mr. K is wrong, and I look at the Facebook post of somebody I used to know named Mr. K. That's what I call him anyway. I keep him relatively anonymous so as to not lead to harassment of him on social media. Plus, it also makes it easier to do this podcast because he's less likely to delete his Facebook page or whatever. But he does post stupid stuff on there for me to debunk. And as with apparently all right wingers, the constant bashing of immigrants never ends for Mr. K. It's just something he's constantly talking about. I don't know if there's been a single day where he hasn't posted something that was at least somewhat bashing immigrants. It's just a regular thing. So I'm going to debunk the premise of a right wing meme that he shared. It says current federal law says you must know English to become a citizen, so why are foreign language ballots even printed? So I'm going to debunk that pretty easily here. For one thing, it's misstating the law. It's true that naturalization applicants must demonstrate basic English proficiency, but the law only requires the ability to read, write, and speak simple English, not fluency. And it should be noted that plenty of people born here in the United States and who even have white skin might not be considered particularly fluent in the English language themselves. So that might be a little bit of food for thought on this topic. Putting that aside, many lawful citizens are born in the US or become citizens through their parents and never had to take that test at all. There are also legal exemptions. Older immigrants with long residency can be naturalized without the English requirement. So, how about that? So, not every citizen has strong English skills. And I have to wonder, like, if we're really a free society that values free speech and all that kind of stuff, should the government really punish people for not having the best English? Or would a free society actually maybe still accept that type of person? Maybe encourage them to be multilingual, but nevertheless still let them have the freedom that they want? So, another thing that's wrong with the meme is that citizenship does not equal voters with perfect English. That simple premise. Once you're a citizen, you have the right to vote, period. There's no English test for voting, but of course, a lot of these right wingers would like there to be one of those. They want to restrict voting to only a small number of people. And that's a constant pattern in right wing politics, assuming they want people to vote at all. Some of them, they might be fine with an outright dictatorship. So, another point is that the reason ballots come in multiple languages, I shouldn't overlook that too. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and amendments in 1975 requires jurisdictions to provide multilingual ballots if a significant portion of voting age citizens are members of a language minority group and have limited English proficiency. So, to my mind, which is a fair I would like to think I'm fair minded. That sounds good. You know, I, uh, I like that idea, and I'll be damned if anybody can come up with a sound argument against that. If it isn't a problem, why make it into a problem? Congress passed this because language barriers were being used as a tool of voter suppression. And again, if you're a fair minded person, you don't want voter suppression. You want people to have a voice in the society that they live in. But of course, the immigrant bashers out there, they don't want those people here. They'll tell you that about as well as I am right now. And it's really a question of, do you actually value freedom? Do you do you believe that people should be able to, you know, relatively freely participate in a society, or do you think there should be sort of arbitrary hurdles thrown around all over the place? Just creating distinctions between people that don't necessarily even have to be there, but you're doing it because you're bigoted against that group and you don't want them to be able to exist and thrive in your neighborhood or something like that. Instead of doing that, how about we let people live and work where they want with relative freedom, so long as they're not like the proverbial Ted Bundy or something like that. How about that idea? And that's exactly why the Trump administration is trying to depict all of these immigrants as if they are maniacs, as if they're all gangsters or whatever, the terrorists. They call Kilmar Abrego Garcia a terrorist. Well, what terrorist act? What terror attack did he participate in? Shouldn't you have to prove that in a court of law or something like that? But no, due process is now a far left concept thanks to these right wing piles of shit who are just trying to get us to be afraid of all of these immigrants, and they'll just make stuff up about them, like they did about the Haitians supposedly eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. And in the case of Abrego Garcia, they keep on shifting the narrative. They're saying because he had gang tattoos, he can't be, you know, anybody other than danger. Well, he didn't actually have gang tattoos. And you know what? Even if somebody has tattoos you don't like, that's not illegal. We have free speech in this country. You're allowed to have tattoos. And that's really a part of the narrative that's not being said often enough. That or I suppose I should say the counter narrative. But if you have offensive tattoos, whether they're gang tattoos or whatever, you're actually technically allowed to exist in the United States because it's a free speech issue at that point. And if you can prove that an offensive tattoo or maybe an offensive logo on somebody's baseball cap or something, if you can prove that that is like a serious threat to public safety, then well, I'd like to hear that argument because it's a pretty tough one because we allow for things like Confederate flags. You know, even Nazis are able to march around freely in the United States, which some people oppose, by the way, but technically it's allowed under the U.S. Constitution. And the question there is, if that's allowed, then how come people are so offended by things like alleged gang tattoos? And of course, in a lot of these cases, they're not actually gang tattoos anyway. Like in Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, the tattoos, that they were just like photoshopped on. It was like a bad Photoshop job, but they still claimed that, oh, he belongs to a gang because of these numbers or whatever on his knuckles that we photoshopped in. But again, even if they weren't photoshopped on, he's still free to have tattoos in the United States. That's not a crime. Moving on from that talking point, what about the practical reality of it? Printing ballots in Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Navajo, etc. isn't about catering to foreigners. It's about ensuring eligible U.S. citizens, often elderly or marginalized groups, can exercise their constitutional right to vote. So if you can make different language ballots available, then you should. You should not just choose to discriminate just because you don't like a certain group. Because guess what? Theoretically, if English was to become not the majority language anymore, which these people are so afraid of, well, guess what? They could apply the same argument against you that you are trying to apply to them, and they could choose to discriminate against you. And, some might say they would feel justified in doing so because, it's like a form of revenge. But fortunately for these bigots, if that was to happen hypothetically, I think most of these immigrants would not actually, flip the script and pull a reverse, you know, uh, I guess, scheme on them. I don't think they would actually start to like target English speaking people or anything like that because, I wouldn't say it would be impossible, but, most of these immigrants, they're not fucking dumb like that. Just quite frankly, most of them are just here to work at ordinary jobs, lead relatively ordinary lives. They're trying to improve their situations. And of course, the right wingers out there, they'll love to latch onto any example they can find of a non white person committing a crime, especially against a white person. And they'll run with that political football for like a million miles and say, see, how come the liberals don't care about this victim of crime or whatever? But crime happens in any group, in any demographic. It's not necessarily a national crisis, even if somebody gets murdered. People sometimes do get murdered. I know somebody whose grandmother was murdered, and it didn't make any national headlines. And why not? Because, well, Fox News didn't choose to cover that story because it wasn't a non white person who killed somebody. So, oops, you can't cover that because it's not convenient for white supremacist narratives or white nationalist narratives, however you want to put it. I guess they're technically different terms, but they're very similar. They're basically interchangeable. White nationalists and white supremacists. But anyway, I think I've said just about enough on this topic. The point is that, the bottom line, the meme confuses immigration law with voting rights. English proficiency is a narrow requirement for some paths to citizenship, but once someone is a citizen, their right to vote doesn't hinge on how well they speak English. Foreign language ballots exist to make sure all citizens can participate fully in democracy. And if you don't like that, well, you you can get on out. As the rednecks often say, if you critique America, get out. So if you don't like freedom, get out.